Thank you so much, Steve. Welcome everyone to the webinar today. In this webinar series, the Administration for Community Living's National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center has partnered with the American Society on Aging, and we're pleased to have all of you in attendance. Our speaker today for the webinar, Younger Onset Alzheimer's Disease, Exploring the Emotional Experience and the Importance of Community, is Susan Frick. Ms. Frick is a licensed social worker and has worked for 22 years at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center in Chicago. Since 2004, she has directed Without Warning, one of the largest support programs in the country for those living with younger onset Alzheimer's disease. Her presentation today is based on the experience of Without Warning group members. I'm going to turn the floor over to Ms. Frick at this time so she can give us her presentation.
Thank you so much, Sari, and thank you everyone for joining in today. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I'm glad there's so many people on the webinar today. I work at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center in Chicago. As Sari mentioned, I've been here 22 years, and we're one of 32 federally funded Alzheimer's centers across the country. We have a staff of over, I think it's about 160 people, and we focus on research as a heavy emphasis for us, also education, and then family care, which the Without Warning group would fall under that. And for over 15 years now, coming up close to 16, we've been running this support program because we were seeing so many more people in our clinic who were young, and we just didn't feel like there were resources specific to their needs. And so this group has been going since 2004, and we've average attendance at our monthly meetings can range, we've been as high as in the 80s, and right now we're averaging around 50 to 60 people, which is still large for a support program. And we break into 5 different groups at the same time, 2 groups for people with Alzheimer's disease and 3 to 4 groups for family members. We've had groups for the young children because and we'll talk about this, when you're talking about people who are young, there's also can be very young children still living in the house. And we currently also have a group going right now for what we refer to as the adult children. So people college age and older will meet every other month. And so from this group, we've really this presentation and other things we've worked on is kind of based on the experience that they've put forth of what happens for them as they're living with Alzheimer's disease. And we're going to see a few video clips, and those are coming from a documentary we just created about 2 years ago. It's playing on PBS now, and it follows 9 families from our support group and looks at the emotional experience that they're going through and looks at the importance of community. And so for each family, we look at who and what is their community of support and how does that help them through this process. And so really a lot of what we're going to talk about in our call today is based on clips from the documentary and also experiences from the support group that we've heard. And so what really makes young onset different? And I'm sure a lot of you have worked with some people who are younger with Alzheimer's disease. You know, it's saying that people are 65 years of age or younger at about the time they're diagnosed, but that can kind of vary because people do go for diagnosis at different points in the experience for them. And it can often be difficult for people this age to receive a diagnosis because people aren't thinking about young onset often, and so they often will have to see multiple doctors before receiving a diagnosis, and they can be told it's things like depression or stress. Women have often heard that it's menopause, and so it can sometimes take a while to get a clear understanding of what is going on for that person. And we've had some people in our group where it can be a couple years before they receive a diagnosis. Some have been much quicker. We don't exactly know how many people have young onset. There haven't really been good studies. It's estimated that it's around 3% of those diagnosed are young with Alzheimer's disease, but that's just a ballpark. We were a little surprised at how rapidly and for such a period of time our group has grown, which I think shows there's a need out there that hadn't been really tapped into, and that there were people out there that were living with young onset. In some cases, and you've probably heard, in some cases there can be a genetic link to this, and so often for them, diagnosis comes much quicker, but in some families you can see just multiple generations where someone has had Alzheimer's disease at a young age. But I have to say, in our support group, the majority of people, it hasn't been in their family. It's just this unusual situation that's come about. So it hasn't been the predominant number have had it seem to have a genetic link. And what makes young onset different? When you think about it, what we've seen is there doesn't seem to be a huge variation in the course of the disease, but it's that someone is so much younger and you're at an age where you're not expecting to be living with this experience. So, people in their 40s or 50s or early 60s, they're often still working, still driving, maybe still raising children. So people aren't really prepared financially to stop working, but also emotionally to stop working. I once in the support group, I often, at the very beginning, would refer to it as you had to retire early. And one gentleman, I remember he said to me, this isn't retirement. I had to leave and walk out the door so much quicker, and when I wasn't expecting it. So it's not your typical exit to work. That often happens. And in some cases, people have even had to leave work under not good situations where they were escorted out or it was seen as a job performance issue when it was really the Alzheimer's disease. Family members are at an age where they're not expecting to be a caregiver. I've had children in middle school, even in late elementary, who are helping to care for a parent, and that's an age you just completely don't expect. They don't have a peer group of people to be able to really talk to, and I think that's why I think community is so important for anybody with Alzheimer's, but in particular for people who are young, because it's hard for them to find their group that is also going through this, and we'll talk about it. One thing that we've seen in our group, and I don't think there's been studies looking at this, but we have seen an increased number of seizures in people with young onset Alzheimer's disease. And we didn't expect that when we started the group, but it has been pretty consistent that a lot of the people in the group will at some point have a seizure, and it's often a indication of a change in condition. Sometimes they do a little better, like an almost rewiring, but it's often a decline after the seizure. And one thing, again, there haven't been good statistics on how many have it, what is the progression. Often anecdotally, people will say that people who are young progress faster, but we have not always seen that. We've seen it run the gamut, just like you see in older onset too. We've seen some who progress very quickly and some who can live with this for 10, 15 years. One thing I've heard physicians here at Rush say is that when you think about young onset, you're often thinking about a person who's very healthy and maybe not having other ailments that someone who's older with Alzheimer's would have. And so we've often seen people go through the entire course of Alzheimer's disease where we might not see that always in someone who's older because they can pass from something else. And now as we kind of head into what we see as the emotional experience, even though this is based on the people who are young, I think this really relates to people who are older too. And I think it's just a stronger feeling for people who are young in some cases because of being at an age where you don't expect it and not having a peer group. But this painting that you're seeing on the PowerPoint here, we have several paintings that are based on conversation from our support group because we had a woman who was a minister and also an artist. And so she painted paintings based on the support group. And this was actually a painting done from my group, from people with Alzheimer's disease, because one gentleman said that to him, Alzheimer's disease felt like he had fallen into this pit. And he could see everyone back out there, but he just couldn't figure out how to get back to them. And so then our artist, Shauna, wrote words that people talked about. And I think as you look at those, you can see how loneliness, isolation, feeling different would be a strong emotion for people with Alzheimer's disease, because it comes about, and I've heard people with Alzheimer's, I had one woman with Alzheimer's say to me that the minute she received the diagnosis, people started treating her differently, that they didn't look at her the same, they spoke to her husband more than they spoke to her. So I think in whatever role we're working with families, if we're the family member or if we're professional staff around them, we want to keep in mind how lonely this can be for people and for the families too, which we'll talk about. And these are just some comments that people made in our support group who are living with Alzheimer's disease, saying like, I feel like I'm fading, that people still talk about Alzheimer's and it's a whispered disease. I've had people with Alzheimer's say that they wish almost that they had cancer as opposed to Alzheimer's, because people at least know how to talk about cancer. I had one woman say to me that no one ever asked her how Alzheimer's is for her. Like no one asks her how she's doing or how this is going for her. And I think we have language to talk about other diseases, and I'm not sure we always think about using that for people with Alzheimer's disease too. And so I think people with Alzheimer's often feel that they're very, like this one person saying, they treat you like you have the plague, that people treat people differently because of this. And so I think we want to keep that in mind as we're thinking about people with Alzheimer's disease. And also family members have talked about feeling lonely. And I'm sure we see that in people who are younger and also people who are older as family members. But this was a painting based on conversation with families where they were talking about their social circles and how as the disease progressed, their social circles got smaller and smaller until it was just them and the person with Alzheimer's disease, which I think is a very limiting feeling. That they said, friends would often drift away, extended family might drift away too, and that they just felt very much alone. And so again, Shauna worked in words that families talked about in that support group. And I know it's kind of hard to see on the smaller slide, but abandon and grief and lonely and anger, and I think we often see this in the family members that we're working with. And so to think about how do we best support people who are living with this kind of feeling all the time. And so I always kind of think about Alzheimer's as I've talked with the people living with it and with their family members, that this is a very isolating feeling and that it causes people to feel alone and different. And I think what we have to weed out and think about all the time, my work before working here at the Alzheimer's Center was working in residential care settings, and I sure thought about it there too. And I also, both my parents had dementia, and so I think about it when they were still living and what I needed to do, that there's a loneliness that comes because of the disease, and that's often hard to combat, or it's sometimes hard to change. But there's also a loneliness that comes because of the world around them, how they're treated, how the expectations that are put on them, how we communicate with them, what we expect them to do or what we don't expect them to do. And I think that's the area we can change. And so I'm always thinking about how, in whatever role we're in, when I'm running a support group, when I'm interacting with families here in the clinic, I'm constantly thinking about how do I make their world as supportive as possible and to create that community. I work hard in the support group to do that, but also within other areas when I'm working with residential care staff or, even in thinking about my own family and interacting with my parents when they were still living. How do we make that world as supportive as possible? And I think we have to constantly keep in mind those emotions of the people with Alzheimer's disease and those emotions of the family members. And I want to show now a clip that really kind of highlights, it's from our documentary, and it's a couple, Pam and Laura. Pam has Alzheimer's disease, and it's talking about how she feels different and how that feeling of isolation, even within her family and a family that's supportive. And so I want us to watch that as we move on to talk about the next area.
There are times when I feel like I'm secondary in this family, and that Laura has does all the decision making and scheduling, and there are a lot of times where I'm fully capable of it, but I defer to her, and to be honest, I resent that sometimes. It's really hard for me to take a back seat, and that's where I feel like I'm supposed to be, is in the back seat.
So there's times where I feel like, okay, I want to include her and I want to have her as part of this, but it's causing stress to have her as part of that decision, because there's things that have to get done, and I'll start pushing because we have to get a decision, and then it's just causing stress. So a lot of times I'm trying to pull away that stress that she's feeling by just taking care of it, just getting it done.
I don't know, this disease makes me feel like there's a black cloud right over here, and that at any moment it could turn to thunder and lightning, and I'll just crumble.
And as you can see, or as you heard in that clip, that tension and that stress between Pam and Laura, and Pam saying, I just feel like I'm always supposed to be in the back seat now, that's where I'm supposed to be. And then Laura saying, you know, I want to have her involved and I want to include her, but I realize that it causes stress when I do, and so I'm trying to eliminate that stress by just making the decisions for us that we used to make as a couple. And so I think when I'm talking with families, and what I'm sure you see, is that I don't think this is ever a perfect world. And I think it's constantly trying to balance that feeling of, you know, change in power that we're talking about now. But I think trying to help the person with Alzheimer's feel that they still have a voice and still have a say, but not overloading them so that they feel that there's too much added stress for them. And I hear from people with Alzheimer's all the time. This is probably one of the main things I hear from them, is the feeling of change in power, that they just don't feel like they have the same voice that they used to have. And I see it increased depression, increased feelings of isolation, loneliness, that it completely changes their relationships with others. And again, I think it's weeding out what's coming from the disease and what are we able to have control over. And I've had, you know, since a lot of this is from people who are young onset, I've even had where children have had to be sort of the caregiver to the parent, and the parent saying, I'm no longer the same with my kids that I used to be, and how that is. But every time I see that clip with Pam of her saying, I feel like there's a cloud right over my shoulder, and that at any time it could turn to thunder and lightning, I just think that's I can't imagine what that must be like to live with that feeling all the time, and to feel like you're almost invisible and that your opinion doesn't matter. I had one person with Alzheimer's say to me, in our group, he said, I'm now just the person who pushes the cart. When we go shopping, I don't make decisions anymore. I don't have, and my relationship with my wife is different now, that she's making all the decisions and doing all of this. And so this is a strong feeling for people with Alzheimer's disease that we have to try to keep in mind and work to reduce as much as possible. And so when I think about it, and how I try to come towards that relationship with both the whole family, is to find ways to create value and role for the person with Alzheimer's, but also their family members too. I work hard to have their opinion be a driving force for our support group, to give them say in what we're doing and how we progress. And I think no matter, again, whatever role you're in, thinking about how you can help that person maintain that feeling of I matter and I I have value in this, listening to their story. We've done, over the 15 years that our support group has met, we've done a lot of public speaking where I have both the person with Alzheimer's disease and their family members speak. And it gives them, I've had one person say to me, this is my new job, that I'm helping educate others about Alzheimer's disease. And I think wherever you are, you could have people do that, whether it be for staff or whether it be for other families. And so I think helping them to find a voice within this is important, and to let them know that their opinion does matter and that you're seeing them as a person who still has value and still has an importance within this. And I think even as people progress, there's ways to still encourage that type of interaction with people. And so I, as I said, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more too, I constantly think about how to encourage community in whatever role I'm working at. But especially, I think I'm in residential care quite a bit in my role here at the Alzheimer's Disease Center. And so I'm always talking with staff about, no matter what you're doing with people, think about how you encourage them to be part of that group together. And we'll talk about that a bit more too. I also think, and I sure saw this with my own family, but have seen it with the support group that I run too, that isolation can come about from change in a relationship. And that there's an immense sadness and grief, anger that can come about, change in roles. I've had, change in, we think about the change in spousal relationship, but also the change in children to the parent. When we're talking about young onset, I've even had parents that are caring for their adult child who's maybe in their 40s, 50s, early 60s, and they're the caregivers for the person. So this complete change in how the family used to operate. I had one, and it might be in the clip we're going to see, but no, I think it's in a different. I had one husband say, which I thought was so true, he just said, I miss being loved. I miss the way we used to interact and the way we used to regard each other, that's not there as much. And I had one husband during a presentation say that that his wife was pretty progressed with Alzheimer's, and he said, we've lost those nicknames we used to call each other, that no one else knew those, and we had those names, and those don't mean the same to her. I sure had, with my own parents, when I'd be on the phone with my mom and realizing she didn't remember our relationship in the same way, and at times wouldn't remember who I was, and as things progressed, I could tell she wasn't responding to me in the same way she used to as a mom. And there's a grief and a sadness and a vast array of emotions that can come about from that. And we sure see that with the people too. And so I think in whatever role you're working, and if you're working with people with Alzheimer's, you're working with the entire family. And so I think to think about how are we supporting the person who's changing with Alzheimer's disease, but how are we supporting the family members too that are going through an equal process of grief and change and adjustment. And so now I want us to watch just another little clip that really looks at changes in relationships for people living with Alzheimer's disease.
This painting, titled The Stage, depicts adjustments people have to make as they transition into becoming caregivers, learning to quietly do so much behind the scenes to support their loved one. Is never easy and not always perfect. But these families learn to adjust, to live and to cope with anger, to become more flexible, display patience, and practice forgiveness.
The hardest moments with her are probably when it's all of us at home and things are hectic, people are moving, and especially for dinner, she gets very confused and overwhelmed. I have my own way about getting around situations, avoiding conflicts with her, and every time is new and different, but most of the time I'm pretty good about keeping her happy and knowing what to do and what not to do.
I think the biggest thing that's changed about myself, and I have to be honest, and it's nothing I'm proud of, is that I am a lot less patient than I used to be. I thought I would handle this much better than I have. I'm impatient, I get angry, I get frustrated, I lash out sometimes, I feel guilty all the time. So those are things in ways I've changed, and I try to think about those and work on them.
Pam isn't her Alzheimer's. We get frustrated with the disease. We get mad at the disease. We get irritated at the disease. Sometimes we direct it towards her. But then we stop and say, wait a minute, that's the disease that we're mad at. That's not Pam. We love Pam. That's just the disease taking control. We still love her, we still care for her. That love will never change. The disease will change, but the love will never change.
Clip that came about, and what we really have seen in our group and how we structured sort of this presentation and also within our documentary was then looking, after we talked about loneliness and isolation, looking at the adjustments families have to make to be able to figure out how to sort of figure out how to live with this new experience. And like Allie talking about who's caring for her mom and was saying, I figured out ways to support her. And like I loved when she said, every day is new and different, but most times I can figure out ways to help her to feel relaxed and calm. And I think what I sure have seen with families in living with this is, and I've had one gentleman say it in our support group, that he said this was a disease that it was very difficult to plan ahead, that it was almost a reacting to, and that you are constantly having to respond to what's happening in that person now. And I think for families who are planners and like to kind of think out what's coming next, and which I think a lot of us have that, I think it's more difficult then when you're wanting to kind of know and be in control and know the next steps. And I think that's not an easy space to be in as a family member. And Nancy, who talked about caring for her husband, Mike, of saying she thought she'd handle this differently, that she thought she'd be able to be more patient, and that she felt guilty and stressed all the time. And I sure see that, and I'm sure you have too, see that in families who are living with this. The clip at the very end with Pam and Laura, where Laura said Pam isn't her Alzheimer's. We get frustrated, we get angry, we get upset. And I loved when she said sometimes we direct it towards her, but then we try to change it up and realize this isn't her. And I think these are all those adjustments that families have to make. And the person with Alzheimer's makes adjustments too. But learning to figure out how do we find good in what is now. And that's not an easy step, especially if you're missing what used to be. But to try to find the good in what's happening now. And as Laura said, separating the disease from the person and realizing they're not doing things to upset you or because they don't want to. It's because something's happening, and finding ways to connect. And I think creating new routines for families is not easy, especially we're heading into holiday months. I think as things happen, we miss what used to be, and finding out how you can make it good as it is now, which takes an immense amount of flexibility and patience. And so I think more than three, but the three families we highlighted within that clip really show this issue of trying to figure out how we adjust. I had the people with Alzheimer's disease name our little support group. We had different names for our little groups, and they came up with the name The New Groove, which I thought was a great name because they said they were learning to be in that new space and to be in the new group. So they refer to that every time we meet of we're in our new groove right now. And so I then want us to think about, in the time that we have, community. And what I found, and what I'm sure you've seen, is that as we've talked, this illness is a very isolating experience. And the more times we can bring people together and have them be part of something, I think it helps. It doesn't change the course of the disease, but I think it helps to ease the burden a little bit. And this painting, which sort of became kind of the logo for our group for a little bit, came about because a gentleman in my group said, I love coming here because we're all in the same boat together. And the people with Alzheimer's just like cling to this picture, and we'll talk about it all the time. And they talk about how being able to know that they have others just makes a world of difference, especially when you're feeling so alone and so vulnerable with living with this. And so I think there's great benefit in figuring out how do we create community as much as possible. How do we help people to feel connected? How do we help people to have a role within the community? When I have our support group meet, I try to remember everyone's stories and bring those up and make them part of the group again, even if they're not able to verbalize. I had one gentleman who he had Alzheimer's disease and passed a few years ago, but had also been in AA, so had known the AA experience, and he talked about how you're only truly yourself when you're with people who understand and when you're in community. And for a while, he would say that every month for a couple of years. But then as his disease progressed, it became harder and harder for him to say that. But I would bring the story back, and I would bring it up and say, Tom, I remember when you used to say this. And he would be able to still be part of the group, even though his verbal skills were getting much more limited. So I would try to remember what each person's role was within the group and bring it back. And have, being part of a group creates purpose for people and also decreases depression. Our support group just met last week, and one gentleman in our group who hadn't been there for a couple months because he couldn't make it, he goes, I just feel better knowing you all are still meeting. And the fact that I'm part of this group makes my life better. So even when he couldn't be there, just knowing that they were there. So again, thinking about where each of you work or if you're part of a family, how do you bring community to whatever you're doing? And how do you encourage that? And we sure have thought, and I talk about this a lot when I'm doing training with staff, and I think it's a great concept of thinking of Tom Kitwood's material on person-centered care, but I think also to think about how do we also think about community-centered care and think about turning everything into a way to be able to be with people who totally understand, as Tom used to say. And so encouraging people with dementia, encouraging families to find ways to interact with each other, to be able to have a place where they can share their stories, they can share their interactions with no judgment, and that people are able to convey this. Because I think, in particular, people with Alzheimer's, I sure have in my group where they struggle to come up with the words or their thoughts. And the group is so great at being there for each other when they do that. One gentleman in our group, his daughter was getting married, and he couldn't think of the word wedding, and he was trying to tell us. And so the group members said to him, when the word pops in your head, just say it. And we were already going around the circle, and we were probably 5-10 minutes past the time he was talking, and all of a sudden he shouted out the word wedding because it finally popped into his head. And the group cheered for him, and they kept bringing that up for months of, do you remember when we, for Gary, we cheered him on? And I think to be able to create that space where people feel okay, and where they feel recognized and valued for what they bring, even if they're, in particular when we're dealing with Alzheimer's, we're dealing with people who their verbal skills will get, more limited as this goes on. But thinking about even within that space, they still have value and can be recognized and still bring something. And so I think in all interactions you have, thinking about how do I create community in this space. I think I volunteered in a home when I was in middle school, so quite some time ago, back in the 70s. And I think about, I was there to help people get ready for meals. And we would have people lined up in the hallway waiting to get on the elevator, and we would line them up in a way that they couldn't even converse. They were just kind of like a train staring at the back of the person next to them. And we weren't thinking community at all. And I think what an opportunity we completely missed, that we weren't looking at that, wanting this to be a time when they could interact and they could visit. And, we've come a long way since those times. But I think even so, we constantly have to think about, are we encouraging community? One thing we do within our group, and I think it would almost be within other groups trying it, is we wear name tags where it's mainly the person's first name, but is really big. And they wear them in our group sessions all the time, and they actually ask for them now. When we go out on social outings, they'll say, can we have the name tags? Because it's a way to create community. And I think there could be other spaces that do that too, where it shows your name is important, and we want others to know what it is. So I think to think about that, and encouraging spaces where people feel supported and can enjoy each other's company. And even though in our support group we are talking about, probably tough issues, there's a lot of laughter in our group too. And I think finding ways to encourage that is helpful. And like one person that's quoted under the little picture here saying, I know I have Alzheimer's, but I have a lot of people who care for me. Thinking that, and maybe it's coming up in the next quote, that I know I'm in a space, I know what I'm living with, but I know I'm in a space where people are going to take care of me and it's going to be okay. I mean, I know people don't feel that way all the time, but I think if we can get to where they are able to express that at certain points, that's really good. And so I want us, for our final video, just to watch a segment on the importance of community and what it means to people that are living with this.
Building a community that surrounds you takes time and commitment. It also takes compassion and understanding. What I've found to be one of the best ways to come together with a community is by sharing your experiences with them. Hopefully, by being open and honest, others will learn how to become more aware and accepting. And with time, you'll find your circle of support will begin to grow.
It makes us feel great to know that there's people that that are there to help, that are there to, jump in if we need. It's one of the most important things is we can't do this on our own.
Right.
We can't do this. This is way too big.
So how do we create a world that embraces kindness and caring? How do we create a place where people can be themselves and feel surrounded by love?
My philosophy is do your best and try to find love in other people and be kind.
The long road you travel with younger onset Alzheimer's disease will undoubtedly take many twists and turns. From the loneliness and isolation to the changes in relationships, the stress, the anger, guilt. It's not an easy path to follow. But finding community, whatever it may be, family, friends, neighbors, faith, support groups, and seeking professional care may take some of the weight you feel off your shoulders.
I can drop the ball whenever I want. Somehow they're there to pick it up. And so I don't fear anything, to tell you the truth. When they stand next to me, they know that anything can happen, and somehow I'd get through it.
What they said I just want to highlight a little bit of what they said in each of those clips, but I think that clip really stressed the importance of finding community within this space. And I think it really emphasized, how do we work to build that community? I've had families that'll say to me, people will come up to them and say, oh, just let me know if you need anything, which is a nice comment, but it's not always helping, and the family might not always think to say something. And I had one family member who I knew of who he would carry a calendar with him, and when people would say, oh, let me know if you need me to do anything, he would actually take the calendar out and say, well, how about next Tuesday? I could use something then. And the one family, Mike, who talked at the end there, his family was very large, and their community of support was their family. And they actually developed a calendar, too, where one person was assigned each day to be Mike's person. And they would be there to drive Mike around, to do anything he needed. And I think this disease, it's a rough experience to go through, but if we can figure out how to create community, to be around those people, whatever it is. And like Laura, I think, was saying, I know this is too big for just the two of us to handle alone, that we need more people. Laura created a Facebook page where she would put out, I need help with this, here's how things are going. She would give updates. I often think about that we have, for cancer, again, we have things like the Caring Bridge websites, and we have platforms and formats to be able to share with a larger audience how things are going. I don't think we always have that in regards to Alzheimer's disease, and to think about how do we check in on families, and how do we see what's going on for them and know what's happening. And I know it's not an easy thing, because this is a very slow, often not easy, to watch progression. But I think if we can find ways to create that community and that space around people, it's going to be the burden's going to be lifted a bit. It's going to be a bit easier. And I loved what Mike said of, I can drop the ball anytime, and I know I have these people around me to pick it up. Again, he maybe didn't feel like that all the time, but to create that space where he felt like that at some times. And so for him to say, I didn't fear anything because I know I have this family around me to take care of me, I think speaks to the importance of community. And Dan Gadsby, who is the narrator for our film, he's caring for his wife, B. Smith, he just said really how we kind of sum up this talk, and the message of our film too was really that we're looking to create a world where people feel that they have that community. And I love that your next webinar on the topic is about the memory cafes, because I think those are great, that are now cropping up all over and creating space and places where people can come and feel that they're connected to other people. And so, I think that's kind of our jobs, and whatever we're doing is thinking about how do we make those spaces for people in our roles and in the way we touch people with Alzheimer's disease and the family members. And so I just wanted to bring forth, kind of what we've learned from the Without Warning group. But I think even though they spoke from an area of young onset, I think it really responds to those living with Alzheimer's disease and probably other dementias too. And so I think I'll just end there, and then I think we'll open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. What a great presentation. We do have some questions that have come in already, and everyone should feel free to add questions as we start moving through those that have already arrived. You can enter those into the question and answer chat pod on your screen. We've had a few questions come in from folks who know that the video clips you showed were part of a larger video, but they don't have access to PDFs. So they were wondering if there's a way to get the video otherwise.
There is, and actually my contact information that's up there, actually both websites would get you to it, but the bottom one, the toosoontoforget.net, We do have it available as a DVD right now. We we're working on getting it in the libraries to try to have it be more accessible, but it is available as a DVD for purchase. We're working on getting it onto Amazon Prime, but that has taken way longer than I thought it would. So I can't guarantee it's going to be on anytime soon, but we're working on it. So right now, probably the easiest way is the DVD. We have also created little vignettes on different topics because we had so much footage. And soon, I'm hoping we will also have it available subtitled in Spanish. We've just gotten that all done, and it should be up as the DVD pretty soon.
Great, that's fantastic. We have a question come in that the person was wondering if a person with younger onset Alzheimer's disease wants to participate in Without Warning, is their family caregiver required to attend and vice versa?
They go through a little, if they're interested in Without Warning and they live in the Chicago area, they should call me, so they could call that number or email, and there's a little pre-screening that we just do over the phone just to make sure it's still young onset. We have had on occasion people with the Alzheimer's come by themselves if they're able to be there independently, and we definitely have family members who come by themselves. We have actually families who continue to come after their loved one passed away. So we have, I'd say, probably 8 or more people whose loved one passed anywhere from a few months to years ago, but they want to come for their own bereavement, but also to help support other people.
Great, thank you. So another question came in asking about, can you talk a little bit about other vital professions besides social work that you believe should be on a team when working with those with younger onset Alzheimer's? They asked specifically about the role, if there's a role for occupational therapy.
Oh, no, I definitely think there is. There's been quite a rise in occupational therapists going into homes to give assessments and tips on how families can structure the environment. There's quite a few people who have written or do presenting who are occupational therapists. I think they come with a great background of thinking about the motor skills and how to approach people for daily care. So yes, occupational therapists for sure. We have a music therapist who works within our support group, but there's also a lot of other, art therapy, dance therapy, improv is a great one too. I'm sure I'm missing some. I think they are very much a part of the process. Activities and within residential settings, and also daycare and home care would be using activities also. I'm sure, and of course, nursing and physicians are part of it too. And I'm sure I'm missing some, but we've had quite a few people who, we also have chaplains. We have a large chaplain residency program here at Rush, and they help us run this, because we have 5 groups running at the same time, so we have a lot of need for people who can run groups, so we use chaplains from Rush. Even though we're not a faith-based group, they help with the group facilitating.
Great, thank you. A few questions came in asking about how you transition people from your early stage group Without Warning to middle or late stage support type groups or other groups that may be more appropriate.
Right. And that's a real tough one. And we are able to maintain people within the Without Warning program probably far longer than most support groups do, because we have the music therapist. And so we have actually people who have been on hospice and still continue in our group. What we have always said is, if they start to need, if they aren't able to focus and they need more direction than what we can do as staff, they have to have someone who stays with them. So right now we have a gentleman who comes in a wheelchair, very late stage, but he has a caregiver, paid caregiver who lives in the house with the family, and he stays with him in the group. We have had to ask people at a certain point if they're not able to, if they don't seem to benefit from the group, or else if they are disrupting the group process, because we're not really an activity-driven group, it's a support group. So there have been times when we've had to talk with families about, we just don't think they're receiving the same benefit. Often families have self-selected, and they will, at some point, either the person gets placed or they will, they will not bring them to the group anymore because it's also stressful to them. So we haven't had to do it as much as probably some support groups, but have. And I know that's the tricky one. And actually, I should have added, there's a website we developed for people who run support groups called toolkitproject.net, and it's based on the experience of Without Warning, because I think there's a lot of people running support groups who don't come from a social work background or from a counseling background. And so we put that together to kind of help give tips and suggestions, because it's not easy running support groups.
Great, thank you. Question came in wondering if any of your, the people with young onset Alzheimer's disease have shared with you or their caregivers have shared what kinds of accommodations were made in the workplace so they could continue working as long as possible.
Yeah, that is a tricky one. Some people have used Americans with Disabilities Act to have modifications or to have an assistant. What we sure have seen is that there's a stress to staying at work, and we've often seen that at some point most people are going to have to stop because they just can't keep up. And we sure have seen people do a little bit better actually when they stop working, which is we can't make that call for people. Often by the time they contact us, they have already stopped working, typically, but not always. And so I have seen where, and it depends on if they've had the diagnosis while they're still working. Some people don't get the diagnosis until after they've left the job. Sometimes people will, we had a few people, one gentleman I'm thinking of who was a school teacher for special ed students, and they actually moved him into more of a teacher's aide role, but then even for a while, but then even at some point that didn't work and he needed to stop. So it's a tricky one, and it's so hard because for so many people, their identity, especially at this age, is so enmeshed with their work, and having it stop like that is rough.
Great, thank you so much. A question came in if you could talk a little bit more about how you manage grief and anticipatory grief for the caregiver or care partner and the person with dementia.
Yeah, and I don't know if I have the perfect answer on that one, but yeah, but boy, now how our group has changed over time. It used to be we just had a group for people with Alzheimer's and a group for family members, and so the family members were at all different points. Now we try to do it more early, middle, late in the disease, but it's not always perfect that way. But we try to talk about or have times where people will say, here's what to expect. We often will also have speakers at times to kind of help prepare what might be coming. We've read some books on grief and had group discussions. We've had some book clubs and had group discussions. And, for the people with Alzheimer's, giving them space to talk about, like we have one woman right now who probably is pretty close to me in age and her son is getting married in November, so just in a few weeks. And she's talked a lot about being upset about what type of person she's going to be at the time of the wedding, not being who she wishes she could be, that she's not as engaging, that she's not as confident. And so we actually talked with her about having someone set up at the wedding who was her assistant and would be there to just help navigate and get her through the day, and they have a room waiting where she can go and rest if she needs to. But I think giving her that space where she could talk about the grief of that she's changed and that she's not the same is it's hard. You know, and I think for families, we sure have seen, and I'm sure you see it, there's a huge, you know, we talk about depression in people with Alzheimer's disease, but there's probably equal depression and sometimes more in the families of what they're living with and what they're watching. And so that's, I think, you know, something to constantly bring up and allow them to talk about it when they want to.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Do you have any suggestions to give family members who are caregivers or care partners that it's okay to take a break? Are there any messages that you have given caregivers over the years?
Yeah, and you know, and I think that's you know, a lot. You know, encouraging families that this is a job that is very hard for one person to do throughout the entire course of the disease. I see it in particular. This is really generalizing, though, so I'm sure there's others, but I see it in spouses a lot, that the spouse feels like I'm supposed to be the one that takes care of the person, and you know, I'm sure you've heard all those people who say, I've made that promise that I would never place them. You know, I think I always kind of say to families, I understand that promise, I know where that comes from, but to not rule things out and not to feel that you've done something wrong if this comes about. What I do like about a support group is I think when they hear it from other family members, it carries more weight than when they hear it from someone like myself, that if they hear other families that have gone through it. One thing we've done off and on in the years of our Without Warning program is develop sort of a buddy program or a mentor and have a family member kind of paired up with someone else that they can check in and see how things are going. Our group is so large that we put together a directory where families that's volunteer to join it, but then they know if they live within the area of other people, and we've had people who will meet for dinner. We have a group of women who meet for dinner once a month, are all caregivers, and check in on each other. So I think encouraging the community outside of our own community is important, because I think when they can hear it from someone else, it adds to its value.
Great, thank you. Well, that's going to be our last question for our webinar today. I want to thank Susan Frick for her fantastic presentation and response to all your questions. And I just want to turn it over to Steve Morse for some final announcements regarding the webinar. And please join us November 20th for our Memory Cafes and Tete-a-Tete webinar as well. Steve?
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's webinar.